My name is Benjamin Lange. I'm originally from Germany and I'm a third-year philosophy D.Phil candidate at St. Anne's College. My research focuses on various issues in ethics and political philosophy. In particular, my doctoral research focuses on what's known as the ethics of partiality. So let me perhaps explain a little bit more what that is. So perhaps just by way of kind of introduction, all of us are partial in some way or another. We can be partial to our own careers and we can be partial to our friends and families. And so I explore various issues that have to do with partiality, understood specifically in the context of being partial as opposed to being impartial. So maybe just to illustrate that a little bit more, suppose that you have a choice, right? You just kind of walk past the river and you see two people drowning, and they're kind of the same age and everything else is kind of equal, but one of them is actually your good friend, your childhood friend with whom you've had a very good and long friendship. The other one is a stranger. Suppose that they are kind of equally old, and naturally most of us would feel, well, obviously I'm not only allowed, I'm perhaps even required to save my friend as opposed to the stranger, assuming that I can only save one of the two. And so my research really focuses on trying to justify partiality. So what is it that justifies that you can save your friend in such a case as opposed to the stranger? Is it the relationship? Is it kind of the history? Some people think it has to do with your project of being in a friendship. I explore in particular a specific form of partiality, which is known as parental partiality. So the partiality that parents display towards their children. Again, imagine now you have children, you give them all kinds of benefits, you make sure they go to a good school, you care for them and so on. You don't do that for your neighbor's children. And that again seems very natural, but it's quite tricky actually to find the sound philosophical underpinnings of that. Another dimension concerns what I call negative partiality. So negative partiality actually has to do with the partiality that you can display to people who are not your friends, but rather your enemies, or as I call them, adversaries. And I'll talk a bit about this in a second here. And lastly, some of my research also focuses on identifying the kind of relationships that can give rise to legitimate partiality. So again, what is it exactly that makes it the case that a good friendship, for example, gives you reasons of partiality, whereas relationships between racists and other types of relationships don't. Oftentimes we'd say, well, friendships are particularly valuable, but what really is it that makes them valuable? And I actually think that has to do with what we might call meaningfulness, or meaningfulness in life. So let me perhaps elaborate a little bit more on some of my actual research areas that are contained in my D.Phil research. So let's go back to negative partiality. So to illustrate this, I think it's quite useful to think about the idea of moral space. So suppose you think and conceive of yourself and your friends and strangers as existing in a kind of moral space. So Aristotle already said, everyone is closest to himself, right? So imagine kind of you are closest to yourself in moral space, and then as you go further away, you have your children, your family, you have your friends, and at some point you have strangers, right? And strangers represent a kind of moral baseline. They represent what you owe to people qua them having a moral status, right? So what are they owed qua these kind of beings which are owed respect? Now, I think you can actually go beyond the stranger in moral space. So what comes beyond the strangers are your moral adversaries. And in a way, your relationship with intimates, with your friends and family, is a positive personal relationship. So it's characterized by positive relationship interactions to do with, aid and gratitude and cooperation. Your relationship with your adversaries is characterized by a negative personal relationship, a morally negative relationship based on ingratitude, hindering, and lack of cooperation, right? And so what the upshot of this is, I think, is that if you go back to the rescue case that I presented, if you now imagine that you had a choice between saving a stranger, potentially, or at least helping a stranger. So suppose you were just helping a stranger with a small benefit, help them lend them a trolley, for example. So that's someone with whom you have no relationship. You just kind of bump into them. Maybe they've moved into your neighborhood or something. And then you have kind of the choice of providing an equal benefit to your moral adversary. Again, I'm thinking here more in terms of bullies or people who are mean to you without really any justified cause, just kind of a jerk to you. Now, in such a case, I think it can actually be permitted from a moral point of view to give a benefit to a stranger. So it can be better from your point of view to give a benefit to someone with whom you have a neutral relationship compared to someone with whom you have a negative relationship. And kind of to put this a bit more technically is to say, well, actually, I argue that you are allowed to discount the interests of your adversaries, which I think has all sorts of lots of interesting implications, and I explore some of these in my research. Let me perhaps also elaborate a little bit more about my other area of research, which is parental partiality. So parental partiality is kind of special, I think, not only because it's kind of the most paradigmatic form of partiality, the partiality that kind of parents display to their children, but also because the parent-child relationship is kind of structurally very different from all kinds of other relationships. So children can't exit the relationship, you know, they're kind of in a kind of dependency. So I think that by itself makes it a very interesting kind of area to examine. And obviously it has relevant practical implications, right? So everyone has a legal right to parent their children, but, you know, naturally one would think that this is underpinned by a moral right to parent. So that's part of the motivation why I examine this. And there's kind of different ways to justify the right to parent. So I in particular look at the right to parent. Traditional way would be to say, well, parents own the materials from their body, children are created from those materials, therefore parents own their children, which is kind of bizarre, I suppose. Other accounts obviously appeal to the genes or the fact that children have been created, causally created by their parents. And I think that might actually be part of the story to do with the responsibilities that parents have towards their children. But I actually think it's none of that. And I look at a tradition that tries to justify partiality by appeal to the special good that parenting involves. And I think a very appealing account has to do with the intimate relationship, that emotional relationship that partiality in the parent-child relationship involves, essentially love, right? And part of that account says that what justifies the family is parental love, the kind of love between parents and their children. Now, I find that very appealing, and I think that's part of the story, but I think this account reaches its limits when it's applied to the question of how parents acquire particular parental rights toward their actual biological children. Now, why is that a bit problematic? Well, defenders of this account kind of say, well, love does a lot of the kind of normative and morally significant work, and the love already begins usually during pregnancy or gestation. Now, because children come into the world already in a somewhat kind of intimate relationship with their gestational procreator or parents, therefore these parents, these biological parents, have a right to parent those children. Now, I think that kind of stretches the notion of a loving, intimate relationship a bit too much. So I think that can't be quite right. And so what I propose is an account that isn't actually appealing to any kind of biology, but it's just appealing to a kind of holistic normative concept, which I call a parental project. And that goes back to a tradition of philosophical views which try to justify partiality in general by appeal to the special value of projects. So I say, actually, what gives you the right to parent your biological child doesn't necessarily have anything to do with biology. It just so happens de facto that oftentimes, or in almost all cases, biological parents have a parental project with regard to their biological offspring. And I think that really does the normative work. And I think that has all sorts of interesting implications, considering surrogacy and the way we should think about parental partiality. And some of my work also explores that dimension.